Hello friends, and welcome back to the continuation of this calm reading of Emma. Tonight I shall be reading for you Volume 2, Chapters 2 and 3. If you are new to the channel, I would encourage you to subscribe and click the bell button so that you will be notified of upcoming readings. Let us find a tranquil place where you can unwind and safely relax. Let us settle into that place. Take a deep breath, perhaps even close your eyes, and let us begin these chapters. Emma, Volume 2, Chapter 2. Jane Fairfax was an orphan, the only child of Mrs. Bates's youngest daughter. The marriage of Lieutenant Fairfax of the Regiment of Infantry and Miss Jane Bates had had its day of fame and pleasure, hope and interest. But nothing now remained of it, save the melancholy remembrance of him dying in action abroad, of his widow sinking under consumption and grief soon afterwards, and this girl. By birth she belonged to Highbury, and when at 3 years old, on losing her mother, she became the property, the charge, the consolation, the foundling of her grandmother and aunt. There had seemed every probability of her being permanently fixed there, of her being taught only what very limited means could command, and growing up with no advantages of connection or improvement, to be engraved on what nature had given her in a pleasing person, good understanding, and warm-hearted, well-meaning relations. But the compassionate feelings of a friend of her father gave a change to her destiny. This was Colonel Campbell, who had very highly regarded Fairfax as an excellent officer and most deserving young man, and father had been indebted to him for such attentions during a severe camp fever as he believed had saved his life. These were the claims which he did not learn to overlook, though some years passed away from the death of poor Fairfax before his own return to England put anything in his power. When he did return, he sought out the child and took notice of her. He was a married man with only one living child, a girl about Jane's age, and Jane became their guest, paying them long visits and growing a favorite with all. And before she was 9 years old, his daughter's great fondness of her and his own wish of being a real friend united to produce an offer from Colonel Campbell of undertaking the whole charge of her education. It was accepted. And from that period Jane had belonged to Colonel Campbell's family, and had lived with them entirely, only visiting her grandmother from time to time. The plan was that she should be brought up for educating others. The very few £100 which she inherited from her father making independence impossible. To provide for her otherwise was out of Colonel Campbell's power, for though his income by pay and appointments was handsome, his fortune was moderate, and must be all his daughter's. But by giving her an education, he hoped to be supplying the means of respectable subsistence hereafter. Such was Jane Fairfax's history. She had fallen into good hands, known nothing but kindness from the Campbells, and been given an excellent education. Living constantly with right-minded and well-informed people, her heart and understanding had received every advantage of discipline and culture. And Colonel Campbell's residence being in London, every lighter talent had been done full justice to by the attendance of first-rate masters. Her disposition and abilities were equally worthy of all that friendship could do, and at 18 or 19 she was, as far as an early age can be qualified for the care of children, fully competent to the office of instruction herself. But she was too much beloved to be parted with. Neither father nor mother could promote, and the daughter could not endure it. The evil day was put off. It was easy to decide that she was still too young, and Jane remained with them, sharing, as another daughter, in all the rational pleasures of an elegant society, and a judicious mixture of home and amusement, with only the drawback of the future, the sobering suggestion of her own good understanding to remind her that all this might soon be over. The affection of the whole family, the warm attachment of Miss Campbell in particular, was the more honorable to each party from the circumstance of Jane's decided superiority, both in beauty and acquirements. That nature had given it in feature could not be unseen by the young woman, nor could her higher powers of mind be unfelt by the parents. They continued together with unabated regard, however, till the marriage of Miss Campbell, who by that chance, that luck which so often defies anticipation in matrimonial affairs, giving attraction to what is moderate rather than to what is superior, engaged the affections of Mr. Dixon, a young man, rich and agreeable, almost as soon as they were acquainted, and was eligibly and happily settled, while Jane Fairfax had yet her bread to earn. This event had very lately taken place, too lately for anything to be yet attempted by her less fortunate friend towards entering on her path of duty, though she had now reached the age which her own judgment had fixed on for beginning. She had long resolved that 21 should be the period. With the fortitude of a devoted novitiate, she had resolved at 21 to complete the sacrifice, and retire from all the pleasures of life, of rational intercourse, equal society, peace and hope, to penance and mortification for ever. The good sense of Colonel and Mrs. Campbell could not oppose such a resolution, though their feelings did. As long as they lived, no exertions would be necessary. Their home might be hers for ever, and for their own comfort they would have retained her wholly. But this would be selfishness. What must be at last had better be soon. Perhaps they began to feel it might have been kinder and wiser to have resisted the temptation of any delay, and spared her from a taste of such enjoyments of ease and leisure as must now be relinquished. Still, however, affection was glad to catch at any reasonable excuse for not hurrying on the wretched moment. She had never been quite well since the time of their granddaughter's marriage, and till she should have completely recovered her usual strength, they must forbid her engaging in duties, which, so far from being compatible with a weakened frame and varying spirits, seemed, under the most favorable circumstances, to require something more than human perfection of body and mind to be discharged with tolerable comfort. With regard to her not accompanying them to Ireland, her account to her aunt contained nothing but truth, though there might be some truths not told. It was her own choice to give the time of their absence to Highbury, to spend, perhaps, her last months of perfect liberty with those kind relations to whom she was so very dear, and the Campbells, whatever might be their motive or motives, whether single or double, or treble, gave the arrangement their ready sanction, and said that they depended more on a few months spent in her native air for the recovery of her health than on anything else. Certain it was that she was to come, and that Highbury, instead of welcoming that perfect novelty which had been so long promised it, Mr. Frank Churchill, must put up for the present with Jane Fairfax, who could bring only the freshness of a 2 years' absence. Emma was sorry to have to pay civilities to a person she did not like through 3 long months, to be always doing more than she wished, and less than she ought. Why she did not like Jane Fairfax might be a difficult question to answer. Mr. Knightley had once told her it was because she saw in her the really accomplished young woman which she wanted to be thought herself. And, though the accusation had been eagerly refuted at the time, there were moments of self-examination in which her conscience could not quite acquit her. But she could never get acquainted with her. She did not know how it was, but there was such coldness and reserve, such apparent indifference whether she pleased or not. And then her aunt was such an eternal talker, and she was made such a fuss with by everybody. And it had been always imagined that they were to be so intimate, because their ages were the same. Everybody had supposed they must be so fond of each other. These were her reasons. She had no better. It was a dislike so little just, every imputed fault was so magnified by fancy, that she never saw Jane Fairfax the first time after any considerable absence, without feeling that she had injured her. And now, when the due visit was paid, on the arrival after a 2 years' interval, she was particularly struck with the very appearance and manners, which for those 2 whole years she had been deprecating. Jane Fairfax was very elegant, remarkably elegant, and she had herself the highest value for elegance. Her height was pretty, just such as almost everybody would think tall, and nobody could think very tall. Her figure particularly graceful, her size a most becoming medium, between fat and thin, though a slight appearance of ill health seemed to point out the likeliest evil of the two. Emma could not but feel all this, and then her face, her features. There was more beauty in them altogether than she had remembered. It was not regular, but it was very pleasing beauty. Her eyes, a deep grey, with dark eyelashes and eyebrows, had never been denied their praise. But the skin, which she had been used to cavil at, as wanting colour, had a clearness and delicacy which really needed no fuller bloom. It was a study of beauty, of which elegance was the reigning character, and as such she must, in honour, by all her principles, admire it. Elegance, which, whether of person or of mind, she saw so little in Highbury. There, not to be vulgar, was distinction and merit. In short, she sat, during the first visit, looking at Jane Fairfax with 2-fold complacency, the sense of pleasure and the sense of rendering justice, and was determining that she would dislike her no longer. When she took in her history, indeed her situation, as well as her beauty, when she considered what all this elegance was destined to, what she was going to sink from, how she was going to live, it seemed impossible to feel anything but compassion and respect. Especially if to every well-known particular entitling her to interest were added the highly probable circumstance of an attachment to Mr. Dixon, which she had so naturally started to herself. In that case, nothing could be more pitiable or more honourable than the sacrifices she had resolved on. Emma was very willing now to acquit her of having seduced Mr. Dixon's actions from his wife, or of anything mischievous which her imagination had suggested at first. If it were love, it might be simple, single, successless love on her side alone. She might have been unconsciously sucking in the sad poison, while a sharer of his conversation with her friend, and from the best, the purest of motives, might now be denying herself this visit to Ireland, and resolving to divide herself effectually from him and his connections by soon beginning her career of laborious duty. Upon the whole, Emma left her with such softened, charitable feelings as made her look around in walking home, and lament that Highbury offered no young man worthy of giving her independence, nobody that she could wish to scheme about for her. These were charming feelings, but not lasting. Before she had committed herself by any public profession of eternal friendship for Jane Fairfax, or done more towards a recantation of past prejudices and errors, that saying to Mr. Knightley, "She certainly is handsome, she is better than handsome," had Jane spent an evening at Hartfield with her grandmother and aunt, and everything was relapsing much into its usual state. Former provocations reappeared. The aunt was as tiresome as ever, more tiresome, because anxiety for her health was now added to admiration of her powers, and they had to listen to the description of exactly how little bread and butter she ate for breakfast, and how small a slice of mutton for dinner, as well as see exhibitions of new caps and new work-bags for her mother and herself, and Jane's offences rose again. They had music. Emma was obliged to play, and the thanks and praise which necessarily followed appeared to her an affectation of candour, an air of greatness, meaning only to show off in higher style her own very superior performance. She was, besides, which was the worst of all, so cold, so cautious. There was no getting at her real opinion. Wrapped up in a cloak of politeness, she seemed determined to hazard nothing. She was suspiciously reserved. If anything could be more, where all was most, she was more reserved on the subject of Weymouth and the Dixons than anything. She seemed bent on giving no real insight into Mr. Dixon's character, or her own value for his company, or opinion of the suitableness of the match. It was all general approbation and smoothness, nothing delineated or distinguished. It did her no service, however. Her caution was thrown away. Emma saw its artifice, and returned to her first surmises. There probably was something more to conceal than her own preference. Mr. Dixon, perhaps, had been very near changing one friend for the other, or been fixed only to Miss Campbell for the sake of the future £12,000. The like reserve prevailed on other topics. She and Mr. Frank Churchill had been to Weymouth at the same time. It was known that they were a little acquainted, but not a syllable of real information could Emma procure as to what he truly was. Was he handsome? She believed he was reckoned a very fine young man. Was he agreeable? He was generally thought so. Did he appear a sensible young man of information, at a watering-place or in a common London acquaintance? It was difficult to decide on such points. Manners were all that could be safely judged of, under a much longer knowledge than they had yet had of Mr. Churchill. She believed everybody found his manners pleasing. Emma could not forgive her. Chapter 3. Emma could not forgive her, but as neither provocation nor resentment were discerned by Mr. Knightley, who had been of the party, and had seen only proper attention and pleasing behavior on each side. He was expressing the next morning, being at Hartfield again on business with Mr. Woodhouse, his approbation of the whole, not so openly as he might have done had her father been out of the room, but speaking plain enough to be very intelligible to Emma. He had been used to think her unjust to Jane, and had now great pleasure in marking an improvement. "A very pleasant evening," he began, as soon as Mr. Woodhouse had been talked into what was necessary, told that he understood, and the papers swept away. "Particularly pleasant. You and Miss Fairfax gave us some very good music. I do not know a more luxurious state, sir, than sitting at one's ease to be entertained a whole evening by two such young women, sometimes with music, and sometimes with conversation. I am sure Miss Fairfax must have found the evening pleasant, Emma. You left nothing undone. I was glad you made her play so much, for having no instrument at her grandmother's, it must have been a real indulgence." "I am happy you approve," said Emma, smiling, "but I hope I am not often deficient in what is due to guests at Hartfield." "No, my dear," said her father instantly. "That I am sure you are not. There is nobody half so attentive and civil as you are. If anything, you are too attentive. The muffin last night, if it had been handed round once, I think it would have been enough." "No," said Mr. Knightley, nearly at the same time. "You are not often deficient either in manner or comprehension. I think you understand me, therefore." An arch look expressed. "I understand you well enough," but she said only, "Miss Fairfax is reserved." "I always told you she was, a little, but you will soon overcome all that part of her reserve which ought to be overcome, all that is foundation in diffidence. What rises from discretion must be honored." "You think her diffident?" "I do not see it." "My dear Emma," said he, moving from his chair into one close by her, "you are not going to tell me, I hope, that you had not a pleasant evening?" "Oh, no. I was pleased with my own perseverance in asking questions, and amused to think how little information I obtained." "I am disappointed," was his only answer. "I hope everybody had a pleasant evening," said Mr. Woodhouse in his quiet way. "I had. Once I felt the fire rather too much, but then I moved back my chair a very little, and it did not disturb me. Miss Bates was very chatty and good-humoured, as she always is, though she speaks rather too quick. However, she is very agreeable, and Mrs. Bates too, in a different way. I like old friends, and Miss Jane Fairfax is a very pretty sort of young lady, a very pretty and very well-behaved young lady indeed. She must have found the evening agreeable, Mr. Knightley, because she had Emma." "True, sir, and Emma, because she had Miss Fairfax." Emma saw his anxiety, and wishing to appease it, at least for the present, said, and with a sincerity which no one could question, "She is a sort of elegant creature that one cannot keep one's eyes from. I am always watching her to admire, and I do pity her from my heart." Mr. Knightley looked as if he were more gratified than he cared to express, and before he could make any reply, Mr. Woodhouse, whose thoughts were on the Bateses, said, "It is a great pity that their circumstances should be so confined, a great pity indeed, and I have often wished, but it is so little one can venture to do, small trifling presents, of anything uncommon. Now we have killed the porker, and Emma thinks of sending them a loin or a leg. It is very small and delicate. Hartfield pork is not like any other pork, but still it is pork. And, my dear Emma, unless one could be sure of their making it into steaks, nicely fried, as ours are fried, without the smallest grease, and not roasted, for no stomach can bear roast pork, I think we had better send the leg. Do not you think so, my dear? My dear Papa, I sent the whole hind quarter. I knew you would wish it. There will be the leg to be salted, you know, which is so very nice, and the loin to be dressed directly in any manner they like. That's right, my dear, very right. I had not thought of it before, but that is the best way. They must not oversalt the leg, and then if it is not oversalted, and if it is very thoroughly boiled, just as Cyril boils ours, and eaten very moderately of, with a boiled turnip and a little carrot or parsnip, I do not consider it unwholesome. Emma, said Mr. Knightley presently, I have a piece of news for you. You like news, and I heard an article in my way hither that I think will interest you. News? Oh, yes, I always like news. What is it? Why do you smile so? Where did you hear it? At Randall's? He had time only to say, No, not at Randall's. I have not been near Randall's. When the door was thrown open, and Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax walked into the room, full of thanks and full of news, Miss Bates knew not which to give quickest. Mr. Knightley soon saw that he had lost his moment, and that not another syllable of communication could rest with him. Oh, my dear sister, how are you this morning? My dear Miss Woodhouse, I come quite overpowered. Such a beautiful hind quarter of pork. You are too bountiful. Have you heard the news? Mr. Elton is going to be married. Emma had not had time even to think of Mr. Elton, and she was so completely surprised that she could not avoid a little start and a little blush at the sound. There is my news. I thought it would interest you, said Mr. Knightley, with a smile which implied a conviction of some part of what had passed between them. But where could you hear it? Cried Miss Bates. Where could you possibly hear it, Mr. Knightley? For it is not 5 minutes since I received Mrs. Cole's note. No, it cannot be more than 5, or at least 10, for I had got my bonnet and spencer on, just ready to come out. I was only gone down to speak to Paddy again about the pork. Jane was standing in the passage. Were not you, Jane? For my mother was so afraid that we had not any salting pan large enough. So I said I would go down and see, and Jane said, Shall I go down instead? For I think you have a little cold, and Paddy has been washing the kitchen. Oh, my dear, said I. Well, and just then came the note. A Miss Hawkins. That's all I know. A Miss Hawkins of Bath. But, Mr. Knightley, how could you possibly have heard it? For, the very moment Mr. Cole told Mrs. Cole of it, she sat down and wrote to me. A Miss Hawkins. I was with Mr. Cole on business an hour and a half ago. He had just read Elton's letter as I was shown in, and handed it to me directly. Well, that is quite... I suppose there never was a piece of news more generally interesting. My dear sir, you really are too bountiful. My mother desires her very best compliments and regards, and 1,000 thanks, and says you really quite oppress her. We consider our heart-filled pork, replied Mr. Woodhouse. Indeed, it certainly is, so very superior to all other pork, that Emma and I cannot have a greater pleasure than... Oh, my dear sir, as my mother says, our friends are only too good to us. If ever there were people who, without having great wealth themselves, had everything they could wish for, I am sure it is us. We may well say that our lot is cast in a goodly heritage. Well, Mr. Knightley, and so you actually saw the letter. Well. It was short, merely to announce, but cheerful, exulting, of course. Here was a sly glance at Emma. He had been so fortunate as to, I forget the precise words. One has no business to remember them. The information was, as you state, that he was going to be married to a Miss Hawkins. By his style, I should imagine it just settled. Mr. Elton going to be married? Said Emma, as soon as she could speak. He will have everybody's wishes for his happiness. He is very young to settle, was Mr. Woodhouse's observation. He had better not be in a hurry. He seemed to me very well off, as he was. We were always glad to see him at Hartfield. A new neighbor for us, Miss Woodhouse, said Miss Bates, joyfully. My mother is so pleased. She says she cannot bear to have the poor old vicarage without a mistress. This is great news, indeed. Jane, you have never seen Mr. Elton. No wonder that you have such a curiosity to see him. Jane's curiosity did not appear of that absorbing nature as wholly to occupy her. No, I have never seen Mr. Elton, she replied, starting on this appeal. Is he a tall man? Who shall answer that question? Cried Emma. My father would say yes, Mr. Knightley, no, and Miss Bates and I, that he is just the happy medium. When you have been here a little longer, Miss Fairfax, you will understand that Mr. Elton is the standard of perfection in Highbury, both in person and mind. Very true, Miss Woodhouse, so she will. He is the very best young man, but, my dear Jane, if you remember, I told you yesterday he was precisely the height of Mr. Perry. Miss Hawkins, I dare say, an excellent young woman. His extreme attention to my mother, wanting her to sit in the vicarage pew, that she might hear the better, for my mother is a little deaf, you know. It is not much, but she does not hear quite quick. Jane says that Colonel Campbell is a little deaf. He fancied bathing might be good for it, the warm bath, but she says it did him no lasting benefit. Colonel Campbell, you know, is quite our angel. And Mr. Dixon seems a very charming young man, quite worthy of him. It is such a happiness when good people get together, and they always do. Now, here will be Mr. Elton and Miss Hawkins. And there are the Coles, such very good people. And the Perrys, I suppose there never was a happier or better couple than Mr. and Mrs. Perry. I say, sir, turning to Mr. Woodhouse, I think there are few places with such society as Highbury. I always say we are quite blessed in our neighbors. My dear sir, if there is one thing my mother loves better than another, it is pork, a roast loin of pork. As to who or what Miss Hawkins is, or how long he has been acquainted with her, said Emma, nothing, I suppose, can be known. One feels that it cannot be a very long acquaintance. He has been gone only 4 weeks. Nobody had any information to give, and after a few more wonderings, Emma said, You are silent, Miss Fairfax, but I hope you mean to take an interest in this news. You who have been hearing and seeing so much of late on these subjects, who must have been so deep in the business on Miss Campbell's account. We shall not excuse your being indifferent about Mr. Elton and Miss Hawkins. When have I seen Mr. Elton? Replied Jane. I dare say I shall be interested, but I believe it requires that with me. And as it is some months since Miss Campbell married, the impression may be a little worn off. Yes, he has been gone for just 4 weeks. as you observe, Miss Woodhouse," said Miss Bates. "4 weeks yesterday. And Miss Hawkins? Well, I had always rather fancied it would be some young lady hereabouts. Not that I ever. Mrs. Cole once whispered to me, but I immediately said, 'No, Mr. Elton is a most worthy young man.' But, in short, I do not think I'm particularly quick at those sort of discoveries. I do not pretend to it. What is before me, I see. At the same time, nobody could wonder if Mr. Elton should have aspired. Miss Woodhouse lets me chatter on so good-humouredly. She knows I would not offend for the world. How does Miss Smith do? She seems quite recovered now. Have you heard from Mrs. John Knightley lately? Oh, those dear little children. Jane, do you know, I always fancy Mr. Dixon like Mr. John Knightley. I mean, in person. Tall, and with that sort of look, and not very talkative." "Quite wrong, my dear aunt. There is no likeness at all." "Very odd, but one never does form a just idea of anybody beforehand. One takes up a notion and runs away with it. Mr. Dixon, you say, is not, strictly speaking, handsome?" "Handsome? Oh, no. Far from it. Certainly plain. I told you he was plain." "My dear, you said that Miss Campbell would not allow him to be plain, and that you yourself—" "Oh, as for me, my judgment is worth nothing. Where I have a regard, I always think a person well-looking. But I gave what I believe the general opinion when I call him plain." "Well, my dear Jane, I believe we must be running away. The weather does not look well, and Grandma will be uneasy. You are too obliging, my dear Miss Woodhouse, but we really must take leave. This has been a most agreeable piece of news indeed. I shall just go round by Mrs. Cole's, but I shall not stop 3 minutes, and Jane, you had better go home directly. I would not have you out in a shower. We think she is the better for Highbury already. Thank you, we do indeed. I shall not attempt calling on Mrs. Goddard, for I really do not think she cares for anything but boiled pork. When we dress the leg, it will be another thing. Good morning to you, my dear sir. Oh, Mr. Knightley is coming too. Well, that is so very. I am sure if Jane is tired, you will be so kind as to give her your arm. Mr. Elton and Miss Hawkins. Good morning to you." Emma, alone with her father, had half her attention wanted by him while he lamented that young people would be in such a hurry to marry. And to marry strangers too, and the other half she could give to her own view of the subject. It was to herself an amusing and very welcome piece of news, as providing that Mr. Elton could not have suffered long, but she was sorry for Harriet. Harriet must feel it, and all that she could hope was, by giving the first information herself, to save her from hearing it abruptly from others. It was now about the time that she was likely to call, if she were to meet Miss Bates in her way. And, upon its beginning to rain, Emma was obliged to expect that the weather would be detaining her at Mrs. Goddard's, and that the intelligence would undoubtedly rush upon her without preparation. The shower was heavy but short, and it had not been over 5 minutes, when in came Harriet, with just the heated, agitated look which hurried thither with a full heart was likely to give, and the "Oh, Miss Woodhouse, what do you think has happened?" which instantly burst forth, had all the evidence of corresponding perturbation. As the blow was given, Emma felt that she could now not show greater kindness than in listening, and Harriet, unchecked, ran eagerly through what she had to tell. She had set out from Mrs. Goddard's half an hour ago. She had been afraid it would rain. She had been afraid it would pour down every moment. but she thought she might get to Hartfield first. She had hurried on as fast as possible. But then, as she was passing by the house where a young woman was making up a gown for her, she thought she would just step in and see how it went on. And, though she did not seem to stay half a moment there, soon after she came out, it began to rain, and she did not know what to do, so she ran on directly, as fast as she could, and took shelter at Ford's. Ford's was the principal woolen draper, line draper, and haberdasher's shop united. The shop, first in size and fashion in the place. And so, there she had sat, without an idea of anything in the world, full 10 minutes perhaps, when all of a sudden, who should come in? To be sure, it was very odd. But they always dealt at Ford's. Who should come in but Miss Elizabeth Martin and her brother? Dear Miss Woodhouse, only think. I thought I should have fainted. I did not know what to do. I was sitting near the door. Elizabeth saw me directly, but he did not. He was busy with the umbrella. I am sure she saw me, but she looked away directly and took no notice. And they both went to quite the farther end of the shop. And I kept sitting near the door. Oh dear, I was so miserable. I am sure I must have been as white as my gown. I could not go away, you know, because of the rain, but I did so wish myself anywhere in the world but there. Oh dear Miss Woodhouse. Well, at last, I fancy, he looked round and saw me, for instead of going on with her buyings, they began whispering to one another. I'm sure they were talking of me, and I could not help thinking that he was persuading her to speak to me. Do you think he was, Miss Woodhouse? For presently she came forward, came quite up to me, and asked me how I did, and seemed ready to shake hands, if I would. She did not do any of it in the same way that she used. I could see she was altered, but however she seemed to try to be very friendly, and we shook hands and stood talking some time. But I know no more what I said. I was in such a tremble. I remember she said she was sorry we never met now, which I thought almost too kind. Dear Miss Woodhouse, I was absolutely miserable. By that time it was beginning to hold up, and I was determined that nothing should stop me from getting away. And then, only think, I found he was coming up towards me too, slowly, you know, and as if he did not quite know what to do. And so he came and spoke, and I answered. And I stood for a minute, feeling dreadfully, you know. One can't tell how. And then I took courage, and said it did not rain, and I must go. And so off I set. And I had not gone 3 yards from the door, when he came after me, only to say if I was going to Hartfield, he thought I must better go round by Mr. Cole's stables, for I should find the near way quite flooded by this rain. Oh dear, I thought it would have been the death of me. So I said I was very much obliged to him. You know, I could not do less. And then he went back to Elizabeth, and I came round by the stables. I believe I did, but I hardly knew where I was, or anything about it. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, I would rather done anything than have it happen. And yet, you know, there was a sort of satisfaction in seeing him behave so pleasantly and so kind. And Elizabeth, too. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, do talk to me and make me comfortable again. Very sincerely did Emma wish to do so, but it was not immediately in her power. She was obliged to stop and think. She was not thoroughly comfortable herself. The young man's conduct and his sister's seemed the result of real feeling, and she could not but pity them. As Harriet described it, there had been an interesting mixture of wounded affection and genuine delicacy in their behavior. but she had believed them to be well-meaning, worthy people before. And what difference did this make in the evils of the connection? It was folly to be disturbed by it. Of course, he must be sorry to lose her. They must be all sorry. Ambition as well as love had probably been mortified. They might all have hoped to rise by Harriet's acquaintance. And besides, what was the value of Harriet's description? So easily pleased, so little discerning. What signified her praise? She exerted herself, and did try to make her comfortable, by considering all that had passed as a mere trifle, and quite unworthy of being dwelt on. "It might be distressing for the moment," said she, "but you seem to have behaved extremely well, and it is over, and may never, can never, as a first meeting, occur again, and therefore you need not think about it." Harriet said, "Very true," and she would not think about it, but still she talked of it. Still she could talk of nothing else. And Emma, at last, in order to put the Martins out of her head, was obliged to hurry on the news which she had meant to give with so much tender caution. Hardly knowing herself whether to rejoice or be angry, ashamed or only amused. At such a state of mind in poor Harriet, such a conclusion of Mr. Elton's importance with her. Mr. Elton's rights, however, gradually revived. Though she did not feel the first intelligence as she might have done the day before, or an hour before, its interest soon increased, and before the first conversation was over, she had talked herself into all the sensations of curiosity, wonder and regret, pain and pleasure, as to this fortunate Miss Hawkins, which could conduce to place the Martins under proper subordination in her fancy. Emma learned to be rather glad that there had been such a meeting. It had been serviceable in deadening the first shock, without retaining any influence to alarm. As Harriet now lived, the Martins could not get at her without seeking her, where hitherto they had wanted either the courage or the condescension to seek her. For, since her refusal of the brother, the sister never had been at Mrs. Goddard's, and a 12-month might pass without their being thrown together again, with any necessity or even any power of speech.